This morning we started taking a look at the gender roles that God has put into place for us as Christians, for us in the church. And those things take root in the order of creation. Men are to be leaders in their homes, leaders of their families, and that then rolls over into leadership and worship and leadership in the church. Yet as we saw, men are not supreme. God has placed authority over men, the authority of Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3, Christ is the head of every man. The man, or the husband, is the head of a woman, the wife, and God is the head of Christ. This is a very serious responsibility that should be seen as a very sobering thing. God expects from men to spiritually lead their homes. Those men who do so faithfully, those men who are holy, are then to lead in worship and in the church. But now that Paul has addressed the men and he's told them what he expects from them, or rather what God expects from us, Paul then can turn his attention toward the women in his audience. So if you're not already there, we're in 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy 2. And as he turns his attention to the men, again you can hear the husbands silently cheering in the background. They're very excited because they know what Paul's going to say. And so they're very excited to hear God tell their wives to submit to them, right? But just as with the men, there's more to this than just that side of the picture. When liberal theologians, when atheists come to this passage, they come to this passage to try to prove to us that the Apostle Paul is a misogynist, that he hates women and he thinks that they're basically worthless. But when they do so, they have completely misunderstood this text. In the book of Galatians, chapter 3, verse 28, Paul wrote and said, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is no male and female, but you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, when Paul says this, does he mean that we can just trash the concepts of gender conformity out the window? No, of course not. That's the whole thing that we're looking at. But it does mean that we must take care not to confuse gender equality. Men and women are created equal in the sight of God, equal in value, in worth, in the image of God. We must not confuse that concept with the concept of gender role and authority and how that all works. So, we come to our text, 1 Timothy chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verses 9 through 15 this evening. And Paul writes, he says, likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, with modesty and self-restraint, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly clothing, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women professing godliness. A woman must learn in quietness, in all submission, but I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over men, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first formed, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into trespass. But she will be saved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctification with self-restraint. And as we see in this text, there are a great number of contrasts being made. Contrast between the behavior of Christian women and Christian men, and a contrast being made between the behavior of Christian women and worldly women. So we're going to see those. And if we're going to, sum all of this up in a single word, we might use the word modesty, not simply as a term that refers to the attire that is being worn, but to the demeanor, to the attitude that's described here. We'll get into this in detail. So the first two verses here, Paul tells you to invest in your inner beauty. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, with modesty and self-restraint, not with braided hair, gold, pearls, costly clothing, but rather adorn yourselves by means of good works, as is proper for women professing godliness. Now, as we mentioned this morning in chapter 3, Paul is going to get into the qualifications of elders and what is expected of elders. And one of the words there, the difficult thing with the qualifications of elders is every translation translates all those little bitty words in their own unique ways. And so there's not a convenient way of referring to them. But one of the words that is in there is a word that means respectable. In my translation actually uses the word respectable in chapter 3, verse 2. And this word has to do with the way a person carries themselves. This attitude of respectability. The word is actually, it means to be put together, to be well arranged. And so in a man, there's qualities that we associate with dignity, with being a dignified sort of person, in the way a man might carry himself. Well, this word is used in this text of women as well. This is not a gender-specific characteristic. When he says, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, or your translation may say with modest apparel, that word modest or proper is that same word. It's a respectability, well-arranged and respectable. A woman should treat herself with respect. God means for both men and women to be serious people. That doesn't mean that we can't have fun. It doesn't mean that he intends for us to always be boring snobs. That's not what it means to be serious. But he means for us to take life seriously, to take our spiritual state seriously, and to recognize that the world isn't just about living life and having fun, but we have tasks at hand. Now, it seems from some of the other things that Paul says in other passages that there was an issue with women being immature and being silly. And I think maybe in our society that problem has flipped a little bit. Maybe it's more of a problem among young men than it is among young women. But either way, God expects for both men and women to be serious, to be respectable, to be dignified. But a huge part of this, in what Paul brings out here, is in how, in what you prioritize within yourself. What do you try to bring out within yourself? Do you, as he describes here, do you spend a small fortune on makeup and jewelry and fine clothing, or rather do you choose to store up your treasure in heaven, like Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 6, verse 20? Peter describes in a very similar language. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 5, he says, your adornment, he's writing to the women here, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on garments. Peter's obviously not saying to let your hair get matted and gross and go around naked. He's not saying that. He's saying that your focus should not be in how you look externally, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible quality of a lowly and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being subject to their own husbands. And so Peter brings this out. Instead of focusing on these things that are eventually going to fall apart. Your clothes are eventually going to fall apart. The seams are gonna loosen, and if you have a moth problem, then you'll find tiny little holes, and there's always something to snag your clothes. Your jewelry will get messed up. Your physical beauty will eventually begin to fade away. Instead, adorn your inner woman. Instead, focus on that. And when you do so, you maintain your beauty, not only in this life, but you maintain your beauty forever. You're beautiful not only in the sight of God, but to those who know you, who see the way you carry yourself and your attitude, your holiness and your piety mean far more to God than your appearance. And I want, just as a little bit of a sidestep, to throw this out there, that the solution to men objectifying women is for women to stop objectifying themselves. I'm not saying that that's the entire solution. I'm not saying it's... But you have to recognize that you're more than a pretty face. You're more than the external. What really matters, what has always been what really matters, is that you are a child of God. That you carry the image of the eternal God. And Paul is reminding you to focus on what God sees and not what eyes see. Invest instead of the external, invest in your inner person. And of course, one of the main ways that he brings this out is in your clothing and your attire. He uses that word that means proper, modest, respectable, however you want to put that. He's saying not to shame yourself by dressing immaturely. Don't shame yourself by dressing inappropriately. Now, there are twin extremes. Of course, coming into summer, we're going to see plenty of this. That slowly the fabric begins to recede, and I don't know where the clothes go. And it absolutely appalls me, some of the things that I have seen people wear in public. This is the antithesis of respectability. It is the opposite of treating yourself with respect, of honoring the image of God, of honoring the inner person. Taking your body and putting it on display like a work of art for the world to see is not what God expects from you. Instead, He expects for you to cover yourself up and to display, again, the inner woman. Now, the other extreme, and this is less of a problem because, most of us can't afford such things. But the other extreme, it does involve overdressing. And that's actually the main thing that is addressed in the New Testament, because that was more of a problem with them, was this overdressing of doing these fancy hairstyles. I remember one time I came across a picture from some archaeological thing, and it was this gold hairnet. I don't even know how they made it. It was a gold hairnet that was embedded with like emeralds and sapphires in it, and that it was from Corinth. And they had these extreme. When he talks about gold, he's not talking about a gold band on your wrist or a gold wedding ring or some simple. He's describing things that are far more elaborate than anything we really have today. And maybe you see the crazy things that are worn at like the Met Gala that are entirely out of line with what is appropriate, what is humble, what is modest. Regardless of whether or not a person is covered up, to use your external appearance to display your wealth and to draw attention to yourself is the opposite of this. Okay, I've talked enough about that. But instead, by contrast, he says in verse 10, by means of good works, by your behavior, as is proper for women professing godliness. And if you need some examples that are not hackneyed and overused, I know if you've ever been to Ladies' Days, I'm sure you've heard about Esther and you've heard about Ruth, and you're probably a little tired of hearing about Esther and Ruth. But throughout the New Testament, we have plenty of examples of good women who adorn themselves with good works. Mary and Martha they lived in Bethany, and they hosted Jesus and his disciples in their home during the time that they stayed in Bethany. You read in Acts chapter 9, verses 36 through 39, that the woman Tabitha made clothes and various garments for the widows that she knew. You have Lydia in Acts chapter 16, who is the first convert in Greece, and she hosted the church in Philippi. Of course, you've got Priscilla, who worked alongside her husband in ministry. Acts chapter 18. In Romans chapter 16, verse 1, as well as verse 12, Paul greets a number of women who worked with him, Phoebe, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Persis. In Philippians 4, verse 2, he talks about Euodia and Syntyche. There were a great number of women who worked hard in their churches to provide resources, to provide funds. There were numerous women who followed Jesus during his ministry. And as a matter of fact, women made up the majority of the first century church. You read throughout the book of Acts, when they would go to cities in Asia as well as in Greece, they often had more success preaching the gospel to women than they did to men. And this continued well into the following centuries. But the point here is that these women were not being oppressed by the church. They were lifted up. They were seen as lights, as examples, as hard workers, just as much as the men were. It's about order and role. Which brings us to verses 11 and 12. To respect the order that God has designed. A woman must learn in quietness and all submission, but I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. So, we go back to what we discussed this morning. God has appointed men to be the leaders in the home, to be leaders in worship in the church. And if that's the case, then claiming that role as a woman shows double dishonor. It shows disrespect, first, to the men who ought to be filling that role, because you're taking their responsibility and that away from them. And second, you show contempt for God, who gave them that responsibility. And Paul reminds his audience, God has given you enough on your plate. You have these tasks, you have these tasks. If you stay within your respective roles, you will have more than enough to do. This passage has nothing to do with God preferring to hear the voices of men versus the voices of women. That's definitely not true. It's about order and role. Women are not to be the leaders in worship if there are qualified men. I've heard of congregations, I think Craig has a story about one time visiting a congregation where it was entirely women. There were no qualified men to lead. And so, what were they to do? But there's no example or authority for women to serve as the elders of a church. There's no authority for them to take on those roles when there are men who should be doing those things. Now, I want to make a note on this. I want to bring this out. Is God calling for absolute silence among women in the assembly? That should be an obvious no, because all members are expected to participate in mutual congregational singing. Ephesians 5:19, speaking to one another. He does not gender that out. He does not say, I only want the men speaking to one another. Whereas in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8, he says, I want the men, the males, in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands. So men are to lead in the worship, but the singing is done congregationally, speaking to one another, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. It's not about the actual silence. You're not sitting by coughing. You're not sitting by singing. The point is, it's about the roles. Who is doing the leading? Who is doing the teaching? How is this all playing out? Now, I know this is something that comes up, so I thought I'd go ahead and deal with this. When we have Bible class, for example, and there's an interchange and for you as a woman to ask questions, to answer questions, to contribute to the conversation, is not claiming this authority. It's not you taking on that role as teacher, unless you do. It can get to that point where it's overbearing, it's taking over the class. But in a moderated sense, it actually enables the teacher to do his job, to do the teaching and make sure that learning is going on. I just thought I'd include that. So God calls for you as women to respect the order that God has designed within worship, as well as in the home. We come into this now. Submit to your husband, verses 13 and 14. Let's go ahead and read the last 3 verses. For it was Adam who was first formed, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into trespass. But she will be saved through the bearing of children, if they continue in faith and love and sanctification with self-restraint. Now, these 3 verses, this text, is admittedly a difficult text. And it only gets harder the longer you look at it, which is fun. But I think we can break it down and we can figure out what's going on here. We'll start with the easy part. Verse 13. It was Adam who was first formed, and then Eve. We already looked at that this morning. Paul brings us back to Genesis chapter 2. He brings us back to the created order that man as in the male, was created first. Adam was made first, and then his wife. God placed Adam under his authority and then gave him authority over his wife to pass on the commandments that God gave to him to her. And God always intended, this is important, we're going to come back to this is important. God always intended for the relationship to work this way. He always intended for male leadership in the family. Okay? All right. Now what we see instead is that Adam and Eve swapped their own roles. God chastises Adam, Genesis 3:17, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. Instead of Adam leading Eve, he obeys her. Instead of Eve submitting to Adam, she usurps his authority. And they swap their roles, and this may have seemed, innocuous to Eve, but look at the results. Look at what eventually happens as a result. And so, I believe this is why Paul in verse 14, 1 Timothy 2, says, it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into trespass. He's already made his point about why the woman should submit to her husband. He's already made that point. I don't believe verse 14 is another reason why, but a counter or an example of what happens when that isn't followed. The woman being deceived fell into trespass. The word trespass there means to overstep. When Eve sinned, she overstepped. She stepped out of the boundaries of her own role and into the role of Adam. And she trespasses in that way. Before even eating the fruit, she trespasses by reversing that order. Okay? And that creates, like I said, this chain reaction that brings sin into the world and leads to all these horrible things. We'll come back to that in a moment. But Paul instructs the wife to submit to her husband. He gives the explanation why. He gives an example of what happens when that doesn't occur. And then we come to verse 15. This is the hardest part. But she will be saved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctification with self-restraint. All right, I'm going to point out the difficult parts. There's at least 4 of them. The first one, your translation may reword this, but it says, but she will be saved. Your translation may reword that and say something like, but women will be saved. There's a key difference here, a key point. The word she there is singular, but she will be saved through the bearing of children. So is he talking about women in general, or is he talking about Eve specifically? Okay, that's the first question. The second question, what does he mean by saved? Is he talking about spiritual salvation, being saved from your sins? Or does he mean it in a more abstract way? Whatever that might be. Question number 3, well, what if a woman cannot have children? If it's talking about spiritual salvation, is it saying that a woman who can't have children can never be saved? That sounds outlandish. Okay, so we introduce that question. And then question 4, who is it that is continuing in faith, love, etc.? when it says if they continue, does that refer to the woman, who I said, remember, is singular, not plural, or is it referring to children? Okay? So you have all these questions. And I don't even know how much time I spent playing through this in my head, trying to figure this out, because I've heard some very bad explanations. So I'm going to give you two possibilities that I think they're both legitimate possibilities. I'll tell you which one I have concluded. I'm going to give you two legitimate possibilities and let you make your own judgment from the text. Possibility one is that when it says, but she will be saved, the woman there is Eve from the previous verse. But she, Eve, will be saved. The saving is that she will be made free from her sin, not by bearing children in general, but by a single event of childbirth, that is the birth of Christ. That's possible because in Genesis chapter 3, you have that promise of the woman's seed, the Messiah coming, who would eventually defeat the serpent. Okay, I could see that being possible. And in that case, salvation is not only made possible for her, for Eve, but also for women in general. They, if they adhere to the roles that God has put into place for them. Okay, that's possibility one. Possibility two is that when he says, but she will be saved, that does actually mean she, women in general. Women in general will be saved, but not a spiritual salvation, but rather a vindication in her role as a woman. If she fulfills her role properly, the way that God intended for her to conduct herself, she will be seen as having equal value to her husband in God's order. Now, I believe that the second option actually makes more sense in context. Let me explain. The biggest obstacle you face when trying to talk about the biblical model, return to the biblical model for gender roles, is that it has been severely abused by ungodly men, by husbands who oppressed and mistreated their wives. Now, as part of the curse in Genesis 3, God warned the woman. He said, I will greatly multiply your pain and conception. In pain you will bear children. And then he says, and your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now, obviously, that first part is a curse. God is saying that he is going to punish her with severe pain in childbirth. What about the second part, where he says, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you? Is God cursing the woman to be in subjection to her husband? No. One, because that's not a curse. And two, because that was already the case. He already established that, and that has been violated coming into this sin. And so when God brings this out, again, he's not bringing it out by saying, you're going to be under the authority of your husband. That was always the case. Rather, it seems that God is describing a consequence. I've talked about this before. But I believe he's describing a consequence, that as a result of her sin, of her overstepping her role, from that point on, her role is going to be secured not in the proper way, but through oppression and domination by ungodly husbands who, in an effort to maintain the proper order, contort the whole thing. And we see that throughout time and throughout history. We still see it in our world today. There are men who think that the biblical model describes one where they can dominate and rule over their wives like some kind of master-servant relationship. And that's not what the Scripture describes at all. Rather, I believe what Paul is getting at here is that God has always honored you. While society claims that traditional gender roles, that biblical gender roles are oppressive, that they devalue you, Paul is removing your cultural glasses and telling you, or trying to help you see the way that God does. Just as men have an authority sandwich, that Christ is over them and that they are over their wives, women are actually in an authority sandwich as well. They have their husbands over them. but the children are most directly entrusted to their care. And rather than this model actually being one where the man is in any real way superior to his wife, they simply have different roles. They both have authority over them, and they both have authority under them. It's just different authority. It's just a different role. That's all it is. That's all it's ever been. And it may have been abused throughout the years, but I believe what Paul is saying here is that through not just childbearing, but through child rearing, through raising up children, I believe Paul is saying, I hope you can see there was no reason to feel oppressed or subjugated at any point. That's never been the case. And you can be saved from that mentality, from that attitude, by seeing things the way that God sees them. Again, in your home, in worship, you submit to the male leadership, but at home you have your own charges. You have your children, and mothers have an extremely strong influence on their children. Just ask Brother Frank. He'll tell you any day. Mothers have a great influence over their children, possibly stronger than they ever realize. Training up your children is more than enough responsibility. God has divided up leadership evenly. Raising up children, spending time with them on a daily basis, nurturing them, doing all of that is just as much responsibility as leading in the church. It's different. It's a different role, but it's just as much work. And God recognizes that. That's why he divided the work up among men and women, between husbands and wives. And I think it's an even more powerful picture when you bear in mind Timothy, the recipient of this letter. Not in this letter, but in the second letter, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, Paul says, being reminded of the unhypocritical faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I'm convinced that it is in you as well. The leadership of his mother and of his grandmother in training up Timothy and teaching him the scriptures and instilling those things in him that Paul says at the end of 2 Timothy have brought him up to this point. Those things that will last him for the rest of his life. That is an amazing, amazing thing that they were able to do that. I know society looks at Christians and they try to convince us and they try to convince each other that somehow Christianity is demeaning or diminutive toward women, and that is absolutely false. It is complete nonsense, and I don't really understand it. It's never been about value, it's about the role. And just as much as leading as a husband and as a father is a serious and a grave responsibility, so also is leading as a mother, leading as a grandmother, leading as an older woman in the church, teaching the younger women, as Paul addresses in Titus chapter 2. That should be taken seriously. That should be seen as an honorable, respectable thing. So, with all of this, we have braved the tide of dealing with biblical gender roles, which is not what I thought these sermons were going to turn into, but the text often surprises me. And so I feel that we have, at least I've learned a lot. I don't know if you've learned a lot. I feel like I've learned a lot from this study, from looking at these things, and seeing really how fair and how beautiful God's plan is for the complementary nature of marriage and of gender roles. I also hope that these things equip you to have conversations. I know people bring this stuff up. It comes up in conversation. So I hope this gives you a passage that you can turn to. It will probably surprise people if you say, there's a passage in Scripture that explains how fair gender roles are. And you turn to 1 Timothy 2. No one's going to see that coming, I guarantee you. But I believe that is exactly what the text teaches, and that's what God has set in place. So if you have any need to make things right, if you look at your life and you recognize, I have not been the kind of husband and father, I've not been the kind of wife and mother, I've not been the kind of grandparent that I should be, that I should have been, I'm going to make that right. I'm going to make some changes. Whatever it is, please come while we stand and sing.